A calm ocean surface stretches endlessly under gray skies. Below the waves, something waits, something nobody expected to find. Deep down where sunlight barely reaches, where shadows dance with currents, there sits a room that time forgot. A room sealed tight for decades. A room inside the wreckage of a passenger ship that went down so fast, most people never had time to understand what was happening. And in that room, in the exact center of the floor, rests a single object that makes absolutely no sense being there. If silence could hold secrets, this is where it would hide them. If emptiness could tell stories, this room would whisper tales nobody wants to hear. But before we step inside that underwater chamber, before we see what shouldn't be there, we need to go back. Way back. To when that ship was still floating. To when hundreds of people were still breathing, laughing, planning tomorrows that would never come. The vessel we're talking about carried a name that meant something once. The MV St. Thomas Aquinas. Big ship. Strong ship. The kind of ship you'd trust with your life without thinking twice. It sailed routes people knew by heart, connecting islands, carrying families, moving cargo, doing what ships do. Normal stuff. Everyday stuff. Until one night when normal ended and chaos began. Picture this. Darkness everywhere, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole. Suddenly, metal screams against metal. The impact comes without warning. No time to grab belongings, no time to think straight, just pure instinct and terror. The ship doesn't sink slowly like in movies. It goes down fast, really fast, faster than anyone could process. One moment you're standing on a deck under stars. Next moment, cold water rushes in from everywhere at once. People scrambled. People screamed. People tried to save themselves, tried to save each other. Some made it, many didn't. The ocean doesn't play favorites. It doesn't care about your plans or your dreams or the people waiting for you back home. It just takes what it wants and keeps the rest buried in darkness and pressure and salt. Now here's something important you need to know. What we're about to explore together is based on imagination. This story takes real tragedy and asks questions that may not have real answers. We're rebuilding possibilities. We're wondering what might have been. We're looking at gaps in knowledge and filling them with educated guesses and narrative exploration. This isn't documentary evidence. This is storytelling that respects history while exploring its mysteries. Decades pass after that terrible night. Technology gets better. Diving equipment improves. Cameras can go deeper. Teams of explorers start mapping the wreck properly. They document everything methodically. Hull sections, engine rooms, galley spaces, storage areas. Most of what they find matches expectations. Rust, deterioration, sea life claiming territory. The normal aftermath of metal and wood spending years underwater. But then something different happens. The exploration team finds a section they hadn't accessed before. A compartment that somehow stayed sealed when everything else flooded immediately. The door remains shut tight, corroded in place but intact. Pressure differentials kept it closed all these years. Behind that door sits a passenger cabin that nobody has seen since the night everything went wrong. Getting that door open takes hours. Careful work. Slow work. You can't just force things at these depths. Metal becomes brittle. One wrong move, and you damage what you came to study. So they work patiently, using specialized tools, measuring every movement. Finally, after what feels like forever, the seal breaks. The door shifts. Murky water that's been trapped for decades starts mixing with the surrounding ocean. The team's cameras push forward into the newly opened space. Lights pierce water that hasn't seen illumination since the ship went down. What those lights reveal makes everyone stop and stare. Because inside that passenger cabin, things look wrong. Not disaster wrong. Different wrong. Most cabins they've explored show expected chaos. Belongings scattered by rushing water. Furniture overturned. Doors hanging loose. Evidence of panic frozen in time. But inside the cabin of passengers from the MV St. Thomas Aquinas, the scene tells another story entirely. This room looks almost arranged, almost intentional, almost like someone prepared it for long-term storage. There are no suitcases anywhere. Think about that. A passenger cabin on a ship, and there are no bags, no luggage, nothing packed for a journey. The closet stands empty. The storage spaces contain nothing. Not even the small personal items people always carry. No books, no photographs, no toiletries, no clothes draped over chairs. The absence feels deliberate, feels planned, feels wrong. The bed frame remains bolted to the floor like it should be, but there are no blankets, no pillows. The mattress itself has long since disintegrated, but even its remnants show no sign of bedding. It's like someone stripped this room bare before the ship went down. But why would anyone do that? Why would a passenger remove everything from their cabin and then stay aboard a doomed vessel? The walls show the expected water damage, paint peeled away decades ago, wood swollen and dark, metal fixtures oxidized into strange colors. But nothing's floating loose, nothing's scattered. The emptiness has a quality that feels almost respectful, like whoever was last here treated the space with unusual care, and then the camera finds it. Right in the center of the room, sitting on a small table that's bolted to the floor, rests a single object. Just one thing in all that emptiness. One item that survived when everything else was removed or never existed there in the first place. A metronome, old-fashioned, wooden case, metal pendulum, the kind musicians use to keep time while practicing. The kind you wind up and set ticking, marking beats with mechanical precision. This one sits silent now. Has sat silent for decades, but it's there. Closed. Intact. Alone. The wooden case shows swelling from saltwater exposure. The finish has long since degraded, but the object itself remains structurally sound. It wasn't just dropped there, it was placed there. Set carefully on the table in the exact center, lined up perfectly, positioned with intention. The metal components show slight oxidation but nothing extreme. The pendulum arm rests in its neutral position. The whole thing looks like it could have been set there yesterday, except for the patina of deep time and ocean pressure that covers everything down here. Nothing else sits on that table. Nothing else sits anywhere inside the cabin of passengers aboard the MV St. Thomas Aquinas. Just the metronome. Just that one impossible object that raises 10 questions for every answer it might provide. The team documents everything carefully. Measurements, photographs from multiple angles, video footage, chemical analysis of the water around the object. They map the exact position relative to the room's dimensions. They note every detail because details matter when you're trying to understand something that makes no logical sense. Why would a metronome be here? Musicians use metronomes, sure, but musicians traveling on ships typically carry instruments too, and sheet music, and other supplies. Here, there's nothing. Just the device that marks time, sitting in a room that time forgot. Was there a musician aboard? Passenger manifests from that voyage exist, but they list names and ticket numbers, not professions. Records don't specify if anyone traveled for musical purposes. Even if they did, why would this be the only item remaining? Why strip a cabin bare but leave this one thing behind? Maybe whoever stayed here wasn't a performer. Maybe they were a teacher. Music instructors carry metronomes. They use them constantly. But again, where are the other materials? Where are the lesson books? Where are the students' practice sheets? The absence of context makes the object even stranger. Or perhaps this traveler was a student, someone learning music, someone who needed the steady beat to practice by. Young musicians often develop deep attachments to their metronomes. That tick, tick, tick becomes a companion during long practice sessions. Could this have been someone's most precious possession? Something they couldn't bear to leave behind even when everything else had to go? But here's where things get really interesting. What if the metronome had nothing to do with music? What if its purpose was completely different? Sound carries underwater. Rhythmic sounds especially. Could this have been a signaling device? A way to communicate? A desperate attempt to create pattern in chaos? Imagine being trapped inside the cabin of passengers when the naufragio began. Imagine water rushing in. Imagine knowing you're going down. What would you do? Scream? Bang on walls? Or maybe, just maybe, try to create a signal, a pattern, a rhythm that might help rescuers find you. Tick, 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 mechanical, steady, cutting through the confusion. Morse code uses patterns, taps and pauses, long and short. Could someone have tried using the metronome to tap out a message? Could they have set it at a specific tempo, hoping the sound would carry? We'll never know. But the possibility hangs there like the object itself, suspended in mystery. Let's try something different. Let's imagine the final moments in that room, not as documented fact, but as narrative possibility. As human story unfolding in the space between known events. Someone sits at the small table. The ship still floats, but something feels wrong. Vibrations that shouldn't be there. Sounds that don't match normal operations. This person knows ships. They've traveled before. They recognize when things aren't right. They look at their metronome sitting on the table. They've carried it for years. Through concerts, through practice sessions, through moves and travels and all the changes life brings. It's more than an object. It's a connection to music, to order, to the idea that chaos can be tamed through rhythm and pattern. The ship shudders. Badly this time. The person stands, moves to the door, listens. Voices outside. Urgent voices. Running feet. Something's very wrong. They return to the table, hands trembling slightly. They reach for the metronome, then stop. Some instinct tells them to leave it, to let it stay, to mark this moment with one final act of intentionality. They open the metronome's case, set the pendulum in motion, tick, tick, tick. Mechanical heartbeat filling the small cabin. They adjust the tempo, not too fast, not too slow, moderate, steady, like a walking pace, like a breathing rhythm, like life continuing despite approaching darkness. The ship tilts. They grab the table to steady themselves. The metronome keeps ticking. Faithful, constant. Unaware that its purpose has transformed from music marker to timekeeper in the most literal sense. Each tick counting down, each swing measuring what remains. They should leave, should run, should get to the deck. But they stay for these few extra seconds, watching the pendulum swing, finding strange comfort in its mechanical certainty. In a world suddenly full of variables and terror, here sits one thing that will not change, will not panic, will not deviate from its designed purpose. The angle increases. The ship lists hard. The metronome's ticking falters as gravity shifts. The person reaches out, steadies the case. One last adjustment, one final act of care. Then they close the lid gently, sealing the pendulum in darkness. They straighten the case on the table, center it perfectly, and then, finally, they turn and run. What happened next? Did they make it out? Did they survive the naufragio? Did they spend decades wondering about that small wooden case left behind? Or did the ocean claim them along with the ship, leaving the metronome as their only lasting mark on history? We don't know. Can't know. The records don't tell us. The room reveals nothing beyond what we've already seen. But that's the thing about mysteries. The spaces between facts become places where human imagination builds bridges, where empathy creates connection across time and tragedy. The symbolism here cuts deep if you let it. A metronome exists for one purpose: to keep time, to provide steady, unchanging rhythm regardless of what's happening around it. Musicians rely on that steadiness. When everything else in a performance might shift, when emotions run high or concentration wavers, the metronome remains constant. Now picture that concept applied to disaster, to catastrophe, to the moment when your world literally starts sinking. Everything becomes chaos. Nothing makes sense. Fear overwhelms logic. And somewhere in all that confusion, a mechanical device continues its purpose. Tick, tick, tick. Order persisting. Pattern continuing. Control maintained even as control becomes impossible. That's what this object represents. Not just music or practice or professional dedication. It represents the human need for stability, for consistency, for something, anything, that won't change when change becomes overwhelming. It's a small thing, a simple thing, but simple things often carry the deepest meaning. Think about the person who left it there. Whatever their reason, whatever their story, they made a choice. In their final moments aboard that ship, possibly in their final moments alive, they thought about this object. They positioned it carefully. They gave it significance through their actions. They turned a common tool into a monument. The cabin stayed sealed for decades after the naufragio. Water pressure and corroded metal created an accidental time capsule. While the rest of the ship deteriorated normally, This one room maintained different conditions. Still destructive, still underwater, but isolated, separated, preserved in its own strange way. Nobody reported anything unusual about this section of the passenger ship. No survivor mentioned a mysterious cabin. No rescue account described anything odd. The official records list casualties and survivors, document the collision, explain the rapid sinking. But they don't tell personal stories. Don't capture individual moments. Don't preserve the small human details that matter most. And so the metronome sat, year after year, decade after decade. Silent now, the mechanism long since stopped, but present, waiting, holding space for questions nobody knew to ask. The room itself became a kind of witness. Its walls absorbed those final moments. Its emptiness testified to decisions made under unimaginable pressure. Its isolation protected one small truth from being scattered or lost. Not a truth we can name exactly. Not a truth with clear answers, but a truth nonetheless. When the exploration team finally accessed this sealed chamber, when their lights first illuminated that table and its solitary occupant, they recognized immediately that something unusual had happened here. This wasn't standard wreckage, wasn't normal deterioration. This was different. This was a scene that demanded attention, demanded interpretation, demanded respect. They photographed everything extensively, documented every angle, measured distances, took samples of the water chemistry. They did their professional duty with care and precision. But they also made one crucial decision. They chose not to remove the metronome. They left it exactly where they found it. That choice matters. In an age where salvage operations remove everything of potential value or historical significance, they opted for preservation in place. They recognized that the object's meaning was tied to its location, that removing it would destroy something intangible but important, would break a connection that had lasted decades. So the metronome remains, still sitting on that table, still centered perfectly, still silent, still alone inside the cabin of passengers from the MV St. Thomas Aquinas, still waiting for anyone who cares to ask what it means and why it matters. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some questions exist to make us think, rather than to provide answers. This might be one of those. We can theorize all day about musicians and signals and final moments. We can build elaborate stories about who left it and why. But at the end of all that speculation, we're still left with the simple fact of its existence. One object, one room, one ship at the bottom of the sea. And somehow that's enough. Enough to make us pause. Enough to make us wonder. Enough to remind us that every disaster, every tragedy, every terrible headline consists of individual human moments we'll never fully understand. The ocean keeps secrets better than anything else on Earth. It covers them with depth and pressure and darkness. It surrounds them with salt and time and forgetting. But sometimes those secrets survive anyway. Sometimes they wait patiently for discovery. Sometimes they speak across decades to anyone willing to listen. This metronome speaks of rhythm in chaos, of order in disaster, of one person's attempt to leave something meaningful behind, of the way small objects can carry enormous weight when context gives them power. It speaks of music that will never be played, of beats that will never be counted, of time that stopped but somehow keeps going. Perhaps the real mystery isn't who placed the metronome there. Perhaps it's what they were trying to say by doing so. Were they marking time? Marking their existence? Marking the boundary between before and after? We'll probably never know for certain. The ocean doesn't give up its secrets easily. And the people who could answer died decades ago during the naufragio. But here's what we can know. We can know that someone cared enough to make that placement deliberate, to position that object with intention, to turn their final act into something more than panic. That takes strength, takes presence of mind, takes a kind of courage most of us will never need to find. We can also know that their gesture worked, not in any way they could have anticipated, not as a signal or message in the conventional sense, but it worked because here we are, all these years later, talking about it, thinking about it, giving meaning to their final choice. They left a mark, a small mark, a quiet mark, but it lasted. Stories like this remind us that the ocean holds more than wreckage, more than metal and wood and deteriorating materials. It holds moments, frozen instants when people made choices under impossible conditions, Fragments of lives interrupted, pieces of stories that will never be complete but refuse to be entirely forgotten. Inside the cabin of passengers aboard that doomed vessel, time stopped in a very specific way. Not the way it stops in photographs capturing smiles and celebrations, but the way it stops in disaster, mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-hope. And somehow one object survived to mark that stopping. To say, here is where rhythm ended. To say, here is where music became memory. If you find yourself drawn to mysteries like this, to stories that explore what we don't know rather than what we do, you're not alone. Humans have always been fascinated by the gaps in knowledge, by the spaces between facts, by the questions that don't have clean answers. These stories matter because they remind us that history isn't just dates and events, it's people, it's choices, it's small moments that echo forward through time. The metronome still sits there as far as anyone knows, still waiting in that underwater room, still keeping its silent vigil, still representing something we can't quite name but somehow understand. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Maybe some things are more powerful when they remain unexplained, when they stay mysterious, when they keep us wondering. Deep below the surface, where light fades and pressure increases, where most of us will never go, there sits a room that shouldn't exist in its current state. And in that room sits an object that shouldn't be there. Together they form a puzzle with missing pieces, a story with blank pages, a rhythm that stopped but somehow still beats in our imagination. That's the power of mystery. That's the gift of unanswered questions. They make us active participants rather than passive consumers. They invite us to wonder, to imagine, to connect with people we'll never meet across distances we can't cross. They turn tragedy into something more than statistics, into something human, into something that matters. The cabin of passengers from the MV St. Thomas Aquinas holds one clear truth. Someone was there. Someone made choices. Someone left evidence of their existence in the most minimal way possible. And that evidence survived. Against odds. Against time. Against the ocean's relentless appetite for dissolution. So we remember. Not because we know the whole story, but because the fragments we have deserve attention, deserve respect, deserve to be carried forward by those of us who come after. That's how memory works, how history lives, how meaning persists even when details fade. The metronome marked time once. Now it marks something else entirely. It marks the moment when one person's ordinary object became extraordinary through circumstance, when a tool became a symbol, when silence became louder than any sound it could have produced. And somewhere in all of that, in the space between what we know and what we imagine, lies a story worth telling, a mystery worth exploring. A reminder that even at the bottom of the ocean, in the darkest places we can imagine, human meaning survives. Quiet, patient, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care, someone to ask why.